recording is set, and now on to the next slide. There we go.
All right. Well, hello. Good afternoon, everyone. So as you know, today we'll be talking about self-care planning. We'll go over what self-care is and what it isn't. We'll discuss some questions to explore in figuring out how to make self-care work for us, which is especially important in the context of caregiving during COVID. I'll also be sharing some resources to help us all figure out what a self-care plan may look like for each of us individually. But before we get into any of that, I want to take a moment to thank each and every one of you for joining us today. I know that in the life of a caregiver, carving out 30 minutes isn't always easy. I want to recognize that by finding the time and making the commitment to joining us today, you've already taken a step towards caring for yourself amidst the crisis that we're living in. And I just want to make sure that we appreciate that. Next slide, please. That having been said, let's make the most out of these 30 minutes or so by jumping right into what self-care is and what it is not. I'd like to invite each of you to think for a moment about what self-care means to you before reading or before really taking in what's on the slide, because what's on the slide is really a much more generic definition than I think what we would each imagine self-care to mean for us. In this more generic definition, self-care is really making a commitment to attend to all the domains of your life, including your physical and psychological health, emotional and spiritual needs, and relationships. Self-care is not a luxury, though I know it can feel like that at times. It certainly does at times for me. It doesn't need to be time-consuming and shouldn't be overwhelming. It's not just another commitment or something that's earned. What we'll be focusing on in creating our own self-care plans is the fact that self-care is really, really individualized, and there isn't a one-size-fits-all approach to it. Next slide, please. While we're getting these definitions out of the way, I also want us to recognize that there's a difference between what's called maintenance self-care and emergency self-care. This isn't something we often realize until we're in an emergency or a crisis, such as the one being experienced globally right now. Maintenance self-care refers to what you value and need as part of your everyday life. Emergency self-care then entails strategies that you can use when you're faced with crises along the way. Both maintenance and emergency self-care are really key to creating a comprehensive self-care plan. If you think of your life as a journey on a road, maintenance self-care is what keeps you going most of the time, and emergency self-care is what helps you overcome the bumps, potholes, unpleasant things that you might encounter along that journey. Next slide, please. Now, going off of that same metaphor, a self-care plan can be seen as a roadmap that has planned vehicle maintenance, travel activities, and rest stops along your journey. The first step to creating this roadmap or self-care plan is identifying what you do now to manage the stress in your life regularly. We all cope with stress using positive and negative self-care activities, whether we realize it or not. Some positive ones might include spending time with friends and family, rewarding yourself even for small successes, striving to engage in positive thinking, planning for the future, keeping a sense of humor during tough times, and so on. Some less positive ones might include withdrawing from friends and family and people who could otherwise support us, ignoring or denying stress symptoms, over or under eating, drinking too much alcohol, caffeine, things like that. Next slide, please. Taking stock and reflecting on these coping strategies that we may not even realize that we're using, and whether or not they're likely to be good or not so good for your well-being is a great place to start in developing goals for your self-care. The Lifestyle Behaviors Assessment, which I have pictured on the right-hand side of this slide, can help you to identify the coping strategies that you use right now and whether they are positive or negative. A potential goal of yours might be to eliminate at least one negative coping strategy. Using more positive strategies can be another goal. It can be as simple as that, reducing the negatives, increasing the positives. I highly encourage you to go through the assessment on your own as step one to creating this roadmap to self-care that we keep talking about. Next slide, please. Now, if evaluating the lifestyle behaviors that you use to cope is step one, then step two is looking at what self-care really looks like for you right now. Going back to our definition of self-care from earlier, we acknowledge that it requires a commitment to all the domains of your life, including your physical and psychological health, emotional and spiritual needs, and relationships. In reviewing what you currently do for self-care, it's important to look at which areas you may pay a little more attention to than others. If all of your self-care activities pertain to your physical health, I, first of all, really want to commend you on that. Then I would like to invite you to explore some additional activities that might really bolster how you care for yourself psychologically, emotionally, professionally, and so on. Next slide, please. Here I've got for you yet another worksheet. This one is designed to help you assess your self-care, and I highly recommend that you not only complete it, but take a few moments to review it afterwards and look for patterns you might see in your responses. Are you more active in some areas of self-care, but failing to include others? Are there items on the list that make you think, I'd never do that? Listen to those inner responses that you have. Listen to that internal dialogue you have with yourself about self-care and making yourself a priority. Make note of anything that you'd like to include more of in your life and start thinking about if there are ways that you can make that happen. I'd add to this list that the list assessing self-care is not exhaustive. They're just suggestions. They also may include some activities that are less practical right now during this time of COVID. As you go through it, add areas of self-care that are relevant for you right now. Maybe make note of what you'd like to include in your maintenance self-care plan for when this is all done, and rate yourself on how often and how well you're taking care of yourself, especially during these really challenging times. Next slide, please. You'll notice I brought up this distinction again between a maintenance plan and an emergency plan. The guidance that is regularly given for an emergency plan is to make one during times when you have the time, the wherewithal, and the concentration to really do so effectively. Basically, they say to do it when you're in a place where you don't really need it yet. Now, we've currently got a crisis already on our hands in ways, but I'd still like to give you the tools to figure out what aspects of self-care might be the most sustaining to you right now. Start by thinking about how you can comfort yourself, things that you can do when you're upset that really will be good for you. I'm talking about those positive self-care behaviors that we mentioned earlier. What do you like to do when you're in a good mood? What can you do to help yourself get through the day on the days where that's really all you need to do? Then you want to move on to thinking about who you've got supporting you in this. Some guiding questions here might be, who can I call if I'm feeling depressed or anxious? Who can I call if I'm lonely? Who will listen? Who will encourage me to do something good for myself? And who will remind me to follow this self-care plan that I'm going to be working so hard to create? Next, make a list of positive things you can say to yourself when you're having a hard time, or maybe when you're giving yourself a hard time, because I know we all do that too. Part of this is practicing self-compassion, which is essentially treating ourselves with the same kindness that we would give to others. Another part is taking negative self-talk and trying to reframe it in a positive way. I'll offer an example. I am currently a graduate student, as Mara had mentioned, and I may think to myself, especially at these really rough times, I can't get all this work done. I should just drop out. Now, instead, I can reframe that to say, you know what, no, I will develop a schedule so that I can get this all done. I can check with other students for ideas. I can get some feedback from professors that might help me accomplish all these assignments. Similarly, as a caregiver, you might think to yourself, I can't get all this done in your own lives or in others. So instead, you can try to reframe that. So saying things like, you know what, no, I'll develop a schedule so that I can get done what I can manage. You can check with others who are in similar situations, maybe through support groups for ideas. You can get some feedback from others as well on strategies that might help you support yourself and others during these times. A final consideration to make in developing this emergency self-care plan is who and what you might want to avoid when you're having a hard time. I don't think this requires too much of an explanation. Not everyone can be supportive or helpful with every situation, and not everyone can give you what you need when you're seeking support. Go to the ones who can be supportive about the specific issues that you're dealing with, who can lend an ear when you need someone to listen, and can offer advice if and when that's what's needed. Once you've got these aspects of your plan sorted, I really recommend kind of having them either written out, typed up, saved on your phone, somewhere that's really easily accessible. That way you can add ideas as they come, and most importantly, that way you can really use it when you need it, because that's what it's there for. Next slide, please. This worksheet here goes through the aspects of emergency self-care planning that we've just reviewed. It'll help you work through what to do, what to think, and what to avoid during emergencies. And it wouldn't hurt to visit this even now, as we are basically in an emergency situation. Another way you could approach this right now is by reviewing the worksheet and reflecting on what you have and have not been doing thus far in coping with the COVID craziness. Next slide, please. So I'm just giving you one last worksheet here, I promise. This one is all about practicing maintenance self-care, or in other words, self-care for your everyday life. All these worksheets, including the one pictured here, will be made available to you following this presentation, and I'm glad to hear that you'll be using them. This worksheet invites you to identify the activities you'd like to add to your self-care practice in each area of your life. It's also useful to identify possible barriers or obstacles that could get in the way of implementing or keeping up with these new activities that you're trying to include. Think about what you anticipate these barriers or obstacles to be. Try to list even 3 or 4 in the spaces provided. Think about how you can address those and how you can remind yourself to follow your plan when times are tough. You can revisit this topic and revise your list as the demands of your personal and professional life change. This is always a work in progress. It's a working document and it can change. I really want to stress that. Next slide, please. Another reminder I'd like to give to you is to make a commitment to yourself and to your self-care. Give yourself the same care that you give to others, is what I'll say over and over again. I say this because your success in implementing the care plans that I anticipate you'll work thoughtfully to create is based on the level of commitment you can make to your own self-care. That being said, I know there's tons of other factors, other things going on in your lives, and other responsibilities that impact your success in practicing self-care. If you're running into challenges with these factors, take a moment to explore why. Do you have a tendency to put the needs of others first? My guess is yes. And the truth is that your self-care is not only essential to you and your well-being, but it's also a necessary element for you to be effective and successful in honoring your commitments, whether that's to family caregiving or professionally or personally. It's really, really so important and warrants us making that commitment despite all the constraints to time and energy and whatnot that we may be experiencing. Next slide, please. Step 6 in this whole self-care plan development process is to share your plan with those who can encourage you to keep the commitment that you've made to taking care of yourself. Friends, family, and others can be really great resources for exchanging new ideas and for giving you the support and encouragement that we all need on a regular basis. Next slide, please. As you go forward and implement your plan, try and keep track of how you're doing. Keeping track of your progress will help you recognize your successes, which we definitely want to recognize and celebrate when we can. It'll also help you to identify and address any difficulties you might not have anticipated as you developed that plan. Don't forget that you can revise your plan as needed. Remember also to employ your emergency plan should emotionally difficult circumstances arise. The plan is always, always a work in progress. Going back to some of those misconceptions around self-care that we talked about earlier, it isn't meant to be an additional stressor on you. I know we've all got enough stress and enough to-dos in our lives. Your self-care plan is meant to support you through all of that. And if it isn't, that's when we know it's time to revise and revisit it. Next slide, please. Here I have pictured a few of the handouts we went over today. Don't worry, I know they are super tiny and these are not what I expect you to be able to use to actually complete your planning. Mara, who set up and started off this presentation, will make all the handouts and the slides available to you afterwards. Next slide, please. Before I conclude my portion of this, I want to acknowledge that the bulk of the information presented here, including handouts, were developed originally by the University of Buffalo's School of Social Work. They've made a wealth of information on self-care, open access and publicly available, so I definitely want to just take that moment to thank them for that. Next slide, please. So now I'd like to stop talking and open it up for comments and questions. You can feel free to use the chat feature either to all or to the host, and the questions will be moderated. I also welcome you to share any self-care activities you found particularly helpful or a strategy you would like to share with the group. Lastly, I'll just say that we also welcome ideas for future topics, so please mention those as well if you'd like. So I'll give us all a minute if we want to submit any questions or comments.
Great. So yeah, we can let people think a second. We have one comment and question for you, Amira. So someone submitted the question, do you have any advice on how to narrow focus when there's an emergency during an emergency? We had an emergency room visit this weekend, and even though I'm typically calm and purposeful, I felt very much unable to figure out what to do next. I was stuck in the parking lot, waiting for a phone call from inside the hospital, and then it says in parentheses that everything's okay now. So do you have any suggestions for how to narrow focus when there's an emergency during an emergency?
I think that's an incredibly tough situation to be in. I just want to take a moment to validate that first. It's something that even as someone who considers themselves an expert in this or a professional in this field would have trouble focusing in such a situation. So I want to acknowledge that first. As far as narrowing focus in those situations, things that can be helpful for me are kind of trying to prioritize and just take it moment by moment rather than day by day, because in one day you've got a million things going on, and thinking rather than trying to solve all of these issues, what is the next right thing that I can be doing? I can't solve, the reason for why I'm at the emergency room. I can't solve any of these emergencies, but I can take the next right step. And that's the way I would recommend kind of helping to narrow that focus. I would also recommend in those situations that although you might not feel like you have a moment or time or whatnot to have an hour-long phone call with someone who can support you, I would recommend reaching out to someone and being willing to ask for help if you can, even if that help just is someone to listen to you and tell you that your concerns and your challenges are really valid, because we all need that at times. So there's no one-size-fits-all approach or answer to how to narrow your focus in those situations, but I think kind of going through that emergency planning form is something that can help you figure out what might work for you. Thank you for that question.
Okay, do you have any other questions?
Let's see, it appears I've gotten one privately. What do you say, or what do you have to say about deep breathing as a means to get back to focus? I really appreciate that having been shared. That is something that I have known to be incredibly helpful, not just for myself, but to others. And I think that's fantastic, not just to share as a question, but to share as a group, because what I have to say is that I've known it to be incredibly grounding to be able to take some deep breaths. It's been helpful to help people identify where in their body they may be carrying a lot of the stress at that moment, and to really just be present in the moment and take a moment for yourself. It's something very easy to do. You don't need a whole lot of time or resources to practice deep breathing, right? It's not like we need to have a paint set or something, or a bubble bath, things that we often consider self-care. It's something that you can do anywhere and at any time. So my take on deep breathing is yes, if that's something that works for you or something you'd be willing to try, it's absolutely something that can be included in a plan for self-care. Thank you for sharing that.
Got another reminder of someone who attended one of our webinars earlier this week. We had a webinar on Tuesday about what's your plan B, and having an emergency plan when you're a caregiver, which, you know, a little bit different gear than this. Like, this is what's your self-care strategies in an emergency versus maintenance situation. But the emergency backup plan talk that we had on Tuesday, that is on our website. If you go to the main lifespanrochester.org webpage, then we have a new tab for webinars, and the 30-minute presentation is on there.
Yes. I also just would like to share, I've gotten another private message. I'm still figuring out all this Zoom thing, so hopefully I'm not missing anybody, but the message said, you know, do we need to be reminded of the serenity prayer, which is something that I feel like is a great way to close. So I just want to, from my recollection, it is something along the lines of, you know, grant me the serenity, I think, to accept the things I can't change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. So thank you for the person in the chat who shared that. I think that is fantastic for us to close on. If there's, I'm just looking in my chats to see if there's any additional questions. If there are none, I'd like to hand it back to Mara to tell you a little bit more about things we've got going on at Lifespan.
Thanks, Amira. I'm seeing one more, and then maybe we'll wrap up if that sounds good to you. So the last question we have is, how do you keep a difficult situation from escalating and going out of control?
If I knew the answer to that, I'd have a lot fewer problems in my own life, but I absolutely hear where you're coming from. It's a great question. How do we keep something from escalating? The easy answer is, you know, we try to nip it in the butt before it gets to that, but it's not always possible. It's not. And I think a lot of self-care planning is really geared around the fact that things do escalate. They inevitably escalate no matter what. It's really about figuring out what we can do to stay safe, stay sane, and stay hopeful despite things escalating out of proportion. I would say, just to add to that, it's a general question, so I don't have all the answers, but I would say to add to that is just reaching out for support. I can't stress it enough. It's something that as human beings we really need, especially in ever escalating situations, but it's not always something that we're really open to asking for or seeking. So I know it's not a perfect answer to your question, but that's what I've got.
Thanks, Amira. Yeah, I just kind of bouncing off of that. Yeah, I think having, you know, to do these worksheets that you provided and what you've discussed, having that in advance gives you some strategies of what will be helpful in difficult situations, and then prevent it from getting much, much worse.
Yes, that's absolutely the hope. And the situation itself might escalate if it's out of your control, but like, these are some of the things, the strategies and the tools you can use that are within your control.
Yes. Thank you, Amira. If we could give Amira a virtual round of applause. I know everyone's muted, so she can't hear you. You can see some of the screens, but thank you so much. We really appreciate your time and putting this together. We have in the chat claps happening.
Oh my goodness. Thank you very much for having me.
We're so glad to have you. So we just have a few other things we'd like to just let you know before we wrap up. And, you know, if you found this webinar informative, you know, please consider making a gift to Lifespan, and we have the various ways that folks can do that. We appreciate you attending the webinar, and thanks for considering a gift during this difficult time, if that is something you're able to do, and if not, no worries, we're just glad you're here. We have some upcoming presentations. On next Tuesday, April 14th, we're having a Managing Stress for Caregivers workshop, and that will be an hour long, and we'll talk about the 4 steps in managing our stress. And the main thing we're going to do as well is talk about action plans. And then following up that workshop on Tuesday, we're going to have weekly 30-minute check-ins about action plans. So if that's something you're interested, please consider attending that. And that's also, if you've taken powerful tools before, you're very familiar with action plans, and you might find that to be a helpful thing to continue with a group. Next Friday, we have The Power of Music and Dementia Care with Liz Marsh, a music therapist who works at Legacy Maiden Park as the Community Life Director and Memory Care Manager. And then on Friday, April 24th, we have Dealing with Uncertainty with one of our Finger Lakes Caregiver Institute care managers and educators, Sue Crane. So we'd love to have you join us for any and all of those. We also have daily wellness programming. We're calling it Balancing Our Lives, and it's every weekday. This week, Lifespan is closed tomorrow, which is Good Friday, but every regular week, it's Monday through Friday from 11 to 11:45. And then the next thing that we're excited to let people know about is the program that is the majority of my job in the Finger Lakes Caregiver Institute, Powerful Tools for Caregivers. We do it in person, but considering the times right now, we can't do that. So we're offering it as a webinar, live group Zoom together. So we ask people to register by Monday, April 20th, because we do need to give you some materials in the mail, so that gives us some time to do that. And if you'd like to register, you can visit our website, the link that's on the slide, or you can call Eve at 585-244-8400, extension 213. So thank you for being here, keeping up the good work of caring for yourself and each other. If you have questions, suggestions for programming, please contact myself or Cindy, and our contact information is there. We ask for folks to please complete the survey. That just helps us to know what works for people, what other topics you'd like, things like that. And then if you are needing additional support right now, our care managers are available. So in the email I'm going to send out after this with all the handouts, I'll also just give you the information of how to get connected to our care management program in the Finger Lakes Caregiver Institute if you have any pressing concerns that you want addressed. And then lastly, if you're not receiving our twice weekly emails coming from Lifespan and the Finger Lakes Caregiver Institute newsletter, FLCI newsletter at lifespanrochester.org, please email me and I can get you on that bi-weekly email list. So again, thank you everyone for being here. I'm going to just group chat everyone the survey link. So if you could fill that out, we'd really appreciate it. And that's right there. So you can pull that open, and sometime this afternoon, as soon as I can, I will send you all of the worksheets and handouts. And again, thank you for being here, and thank you, Amira, for presenting. Oh, I'm trying to unmute Amira.
I was just trying to mute myself, so I was just saying thank you very much for having me. It was my pleasure, and thank you to those who joined for taking the time out of your busy days to listen. I appreciate that, and I hope you find the resources helpful.
Thank you. All right, take care, everyone.
Bye.
All right.